Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Strangest Way, Walking the Christian Path by Robert Barron, narrated by Bob Souer. Preface. Strange Christianity. You know something's happening here, but you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? Bob Dylan. We preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and a folly to Gentiles. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 23. In 1996, there was a gathering of Christians and Buddhists at the monastery of Our Lady of Gethsemane in Kentucky. At the meeting were scholars and monks from both traditions, as well as the Dalai Lama himself. After days of intense conversation and shared prayer, one of the Buddhist participants spoke to an urgent point. What had been bothering him throughout the conference was the prominent display, in almost every room of the monastery, of a suffering man pinioned to a cross. To his mind, the crucifix represented the agony to which the meditation and practices of his religion were the solution. And thus, he asked his Christian interlocutors, what precisely was the point in showing this terrible scene over and over again? Those who were there say that this question, blunt, direct, and challenging, changed the tenor of the meeting for the better, forcing representatives of both sides to cut to the heart of the matter. I love that man's question. More to the point, I love the bother that prompted it. Christians have become so accustomed to seeing the crucifix in churches, in schools, on seasonal greeting cards, worn as jewelry around people's necks, that they have long since lost any sense of how awful and strange it is. But to the first Christians, the cross of Christ was that and more. Paul called it a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to Gentiles, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 23, insinuating that it was sure to bother just about everybody. For the first several centuries of Christianity, artists were reluctant to depict the death of the Lord because it was just too terrible. They felt, perhaps, something of what that Buddhist commentator at Gethsemane felt. And yet Paul can say, we proclaim Christ crucified, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 23, and the entire Christian tradition from Augustine to Francis of Assisi to Dante to Ignatius of Loyola to Trappist monks in the hills of Kentucky has echoed him. Somehow, they knew, that writhing figure pinned to his cross is the whole story. There is a painting of the awful death of Jesus that the German artist Matthias Grunewald completed in 1484 for the patients and staff at a hospital specializing in diseases of the skin. It is one of the most terribly beautiful depictions of Calvary ever made. The two greatest Protestant theologians of the 20th century, Paul Tillich and Karl Barth, had a reproduction of this masterpiece over their desks as they worked on their dogmatics. The body of Grunewald's Jesus had been, it is obvious, impressive and powerful, but now it is racked, twisted, and disfigured, the neck at an almost impossible angle to the torso, the hands and feet distended, the legs bowed almost to the point of breaking, the chest covered in wounds, scratches, and blisters, the head wreathed in a particularly brutal crown of thorns. What is for me most disturbing are the shut eyes and the gaping mouth. This Christ is no longer seeing or speaking. He is simply lost in the terror of the moment. To the right of the crucified Christ stands John the Baptist performing his usual iconic task of pointing at the Lord. But what is remarkable are the contortions in his arm, hand, and fingers as he indicates the Christ. It is as though his own life has to be twisted into a new and unusual form if he is to function effectively as a prophet of the suffering Jesus. When I was coming of age as a post-conciliar Catholic, great stress was placed on Christianity's outreach to the modern world and to other religions. In accordance with this emphasis, Christianity's distinctive qualities and bright colors tended to be muted and its rough edges smoothed, while points of contact and continuity with the non-Christian and secular realms were consistently brought into the light and celebrated. As a result, the Christianity into which I was initiated was relatively bland and domesticated, easy to grasp and unthreatening. Then, in the course of my formal theological education, I began to read the mystics, saints, and scholars of the classical Christian tradition. What I encountered there took my breath away. Whatever this Christian phenomenon was, it was certainly not the beige system of thought that had been presented to me. Rather, it seemed to me the strangest, most exotic, surprising, and uncanny of all the religious paths I had encountered. For at the very center of it is what the Buddhist scholar at Gethsemane and Matthias Grunewald saw with such clarity: a God who comes after us with a reckless abandon, breaking open his own heart in love in order to include us in the rhythm of his own life. Christianity, I saw, was not our disciplined quest for God, but God's relentless quest for us, even to the point of death. God died in order that we might be his friends. Whatever you think of that last statement, whether you deem it true, false, or nonsensical, the one thing it is not is bland. The one thing it is not saying is what everyone else is saying. And friendship with God, not simply worship, discipleship, seeking, or ethical uprightness, but real intimacy with God entailed, I discovered, a giving of self that mirrored the radicality of God's own gift of self in Christ. The point of the Christian life is to be holy with the very holiness of God, and this means conformity with a love unto death. On both the human and divine side, therefore, there is a radical, even disquieting extremism about Christianity, and the best spirits in the Christian tradition do nothing to soften it. On the contrary, they intensify it. It is this strange way that I wish to explore in the course of this book. My purpose is not so much apologetic as expository. That is to say, I am interested not primarily in making arguments in support of Christianity, as in presenting Christianity in its odd particularity. Accordingly, my target audience is my fellow Christians, perhaps especially those members of my own generation who came of age during a rather beige time, though I would hope, too, that non-Christians and non-believers would find much to ponder in this book. The philosopher Wittgenstein famously urged his overly rational colleagues, "Don't think, look." My approach here is Wittgensteinian. I want to show the Christian way as it is displayed on three distinct paths and to invite my listener to look, or better, to walk. I will use numerous and diverse sources in my work of exposition: poetry, drama, painting, theology, spirituality, architecture, philosophy, lives of the saints, and literature. In the introduction, I will argue that Christianity is not so much a system of thought or set of convictions as a path or series of practices. Like baseball, philosophy, or being an American, it is a whole pattern of life. I will also explore the typically modern assumptions that led us away from a practiced Christianity to the attenuated form that I encountered as a young man. Then, in the next 3 chapters, I will present the paths that constitute the Christian way: finding the center, knowing you are a sinner, and realizing your life is not about you. At the heart of each of these chapters will be a literary display of the path, the first taken from Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited, the second from Dante's Purgatorio, and the third from Flannery O'Connor's The Violent Bear It Away. And each chapter will conclude with a presentation of a set of concrete practices designed to keep one close to the path in question. If it is not already obvious from these literary choices, I am a Roman Catholic, and this book has unapologetically a Catholic flavor and orientation. But I have always retained a deep sympathy for C.S. Lewis's project of recovering mere Christianity, that is, the essential core of a classical Christian faith shared by all the churches, Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox. It is my ecumenical hope that Christians of all stripes and styles could profit from these meditations on walking the strange way of the Lord. Introduction. Paths and Practices. Don't think, look. Ludwig Wittgenstein. Bridges once wrote Gerard Manley Hopkins and asked him to tell him how he, Bridges, could believe. Bridges was an agnostic. Hopkins wrote back, "Give alms." Flannery O'Connor. Come and see. John chapter 1, verse 39. Prelude, Apprenticeship. One of the earliest terms used to describe Christianity is the simple but evocative word way. Acts chapter 9, verse 2. This signals something of great importance. Christianity, before all else, is a form of life, a path that one walks. It is a way of seeing, a frame of mind, an attitude. But more than this, it is a manner of moving and acting, standing and relating. It is not simply a matter of the mind, but of the body as well. In fact, one could say that Christianity is not real until it has insinuated itself into the blood and the bones, until it becomes an instinct as much physical as spiritual. Perhaps the most direct description is this: Christianity, the way of Jesus Christ, is a culture, a style of life supported by a unique set of convictions, assumptions, hopes, and practices. It is like a game with a distinctive texture, feel, and set of rules. As such, it is a milieu into which one must be introduced through a process of practice and apprenticeship. When a young man came to a Renaissance painter in order to learn the craft of painting, he moved in with the master, watching him at close quarters, catching the rhythms of his movements and the overall pattern of his life. In time, he might be given a simple task to perform, say the crushing of pigments, and this he would do for many months or even years. Though he undoubtedly found the process tedious and longed to involve himself in the actual painting of a great canvas, the young man did his job and thereby learned, not only the rudiments of color, but more importantly the patience and discipline required for the production of a work of art. Only gradually would he be initiated into the more complex dimensions of the artist's realm of activity: draftsmanship, composition, application of color, use of chiaroscuro, the depiction of philosophical and mythological themes. During this entire process, he would scrupulously follow the direction and style of his master who, in his youth, had learned the same techniques from his elders. Only at the end of his years-long training, having moved body and spirit into the milieu of the painter, would the novice perhaps develop his own approach, find his own path. And something very similar unfolds when a child steps onto a baseball diamond to begin his initiation into the game. His coach moves him through a series of drills, throwing, catching, swinging the bat, fielding the ball, designed to place the requisite skills of baseball into his muscles and mind. When necessary, the master of the game might demonstrate with his own body the pivot or slide that he wants the novice to make. If he is imaginative, the coach invites his charges to watch videos of great baseball players, encouraging them to mimic the graceful swing of Ted Williams or the energetic base running of Roberto Clemente. He might introduce them to the lore of the game, relating stories of the 1976 World Series or the Yankees' 1927 season. He might pass on the wisdom and strategies of successful managers like Tony La Russa and Leo DeRocher, and he might share the goofy eloquence of Casey Stengel. At the end of this process of apprenticeship, the young man, it is hoped, will see and think and move as a baseball player, and he will love the entire form of life that is baseball. When I was 19, I entered an accelerated program in philosophy at Catholic University in Washington, D.C. This was the beginning of my apprenticeship to a whole series of masters and my entry into a world that I still find enchanting. One of my professors in the first year of the program required us all to write a 2-page paper each week on a single argument from a Platonic dialogue. His critiques were ruthless and his grading was draconian. He would return these papers, which we thought ranked with the classics of Western thought, and they were covered with lines, question marks, exclamation points registering his shock, corrections of grammar, and, hovering over all of it, a desperately low grade. One of his commonest remarks was, "You are just repeating standard arguments here. You are not philosophizing." What exactly philosophizing was, none of us knew for sure, but the master's criticisms and humiliations were compelling us to find out. In another seminar, a classmate of mine finished his 90-minute critical presentation on the Nicomachean ethics of Aristotle with the following rhetorical flourish. "What then are we to do with this text?" The professor, an avid Aristotelian, responded with devastating laconicism, "Perhaps we could read it more carefully." Once more, we were all being taught how to philosophize through a sort of via negativa, seeing precisely how not to approach a great thinker. In my final year, I took a course that bore the improbable title, The Analogy and Univocity of Being in the Middle Ages. About 20 of us met on Monday nights with a gentle genius whose native language, according to local legend, was Latin. Under his guidance, we worked our way through the untranslated texts of Thomas Aquinas on this obscure but important issue in medieval epistemology, learning thereby an arcane and fascinating argot that linked us to our distant ancestors in the philosophical tradition. The most memorable moment for me in the process of apprenticeship took place midway through my second year. After spending several months studying the issue of human freedom and divine foreknowledge, I raised a challenging question one day in class. My professor gave a brief response that I found inadequate, and I pursued the issue. Looking at me with a combination of delight and surprise, he said, "Okay, make your case." With some trepidation, knowing that the entire class was listening avidly, I then began to philosophize, not so much commenting, learning, analyzing, but thinking on my own, following the argument where it led. Sensing my excitement, the professor kept guiding me, spurring me on with questions and comments. Suddenly, I was not studying a Platonic dialogue, I was in one, the teacher playing patient Socrates to my enthusiastic Thrasymachus. In that moment, still fresh in my memory all these years later, I entered, however tentatively and imperfectly, into the great conversation of Western philosophy. In the course of that exchange, I became a brother, however unworthy, to Parmenides, Augustine, Aquinas, Hobbes, and Kant. In the course of those 3 years, I entered a new world. At the end of the program, I had not simply new ideas and information, but new eyes and a new mind. I spoke a different language and related to my environment in a discernibly novel way. Those who knew me before my philosophical initiation realized that, afterward, something was radically and irreversibly changed in me. That is what a true apprenticeship does. It converts you. The first words spoken by Jesus in the Gospel of John are addressed to 2 former disciples of John the Baptist. "What are you looking for?" John chapter 1, verse 38. They respond, somewhat surprisingly, "Where are you staying?" One might expect that in the presence of this new rabbi they would have answered, "The truth," or "enlightenment," or "peace." Instead, they answer the question elliptically with another question, and this odd non-answer is, in fact, the key to the exchange. What they seek, what they want to know, is not so much the teaching or wisdom or perspective of the rabbi. They want to know him, more to the point, precisely where and how he lives. In the mystical vocabulary of John's Gospel, the verb menen, stay or remain, refers to the source of one's life and meaning. Thus, Jesus says that he remains with the Father, drawing his being from him, and he promises that he and the Father will remain with believers, feeding and nurturing them. Therefore, in asking where he stays, the disciples are wondering about the form of life that sustains him, the source of his power. Obviously pleased by their response, Jesus says encouragingly, "Come and see," John chapter 1, verse 39. And then John tells us, they came and saw where he was staying, and they remained with him that day. In this simple and understated narrative, we see that the form of Christian discipleship is not primarily listening or learning, but rather moving into the house of Jesus, discerning his mode of life, being with him at close quarters. After this visit with the rabbi from Nazareth, one of the disciples, now identified as Andrew, emerges with enthusiasm, running to his brother Simon and exclaiming, "We have found the Messiah," John chapter 1, verse 41. It seems clear that the body, staying with him, in a significant sense conditions the mind. He is the Messiah, the way of life shaping the conviction. Throughout his ministry, Jesus certainly teaches his disciples, but the instruction always takes place in the far more elemental context of following him, as though the learning would never take place uncoupled from the life. In a word, Jesus invites his friends into an apprenticeship relationship with him, encouraging them to catch his way of being through proximity, imitation, and love. And the processes that we traced in our examples before, practicing, watching patiently, repeating, disciplining the body, are all at work as one is grafted onto Christ. The way of Jesus has, over the centuries, given rise to myriad expressions in theology, liturgy, architecture, poetry, ethics, and spirituality. Staying with Jesus has resulted in the Summa Theologia of Thomas Aquinas, the Divine Comedy of Dante, Cologne Cathedral, the life of Saint Anthony of the Desert, the silence and suffering of John of the Cross, and the radical nonviolence of Dorothy Day. What can be lost or forgotten is the connection of all of these to the originating apprenticeship, to the form of life from which they flowed. Thus, Dorothy Day's protest against a culture predicated upon militarism arose not simply from her reflection, but from the conditioning of her body through a lifetime of spiritual exercises. And Thomas Aquinas said explicitly that the depth of his theological analysis came not so much from the acuity of his mind as from the intensity of his prayer. Both Dorothy and Thomas were disciples who had come and seen. Both had stayed with the Master and learned, through practice, a new way of being in the world. The problem with modernity. I have been dwelling on this embodied and distinctive character of Christianity precisely because I fear that, in recent years, it has been largely lost sight of. The culture which is Christianity, the sacred way, expressed in movement, practice, and apprenticeship, has become too often a faint echo of the secular culture or a privatized and individualized set of convictions. The dense texture of the Christian way has been worn thin, and its bright colors allowed to bleed into beige, and this attenuating has been due to an accommodation to the characteristically modern frame of mind. Whether born of a desire to imitate the modern world or a hope to reach out to it in a missionary spirit, this accommodationism has, I maintain, robbed Christianity of its persuasiveness and spiciness. Every year, a group of students from the seminary at which I teach makes a lengthy pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Their sojourn usually coincides with the Muslim penitential month of Ramadan. What strikes these American Catholic seminarians is how unavoidable, vivid, and in-your-face the practice of Ramadan is. Simply to walk outside one's residence and open one's eyes and ears is to know that something powerful is going on. Ramadan affects the way the people behave, move, gesture, do business, eat, and celebrate. One seminarian was especially impressed by the festiveness at the end of the month of fasting, which trumps any 4th of July celebration he had ever experienced. The rhetorical questions that I have posed to my students when they share these impressions are the following. If a foreign visitor came to a largely Catholic Chicago during our penitential season of Lent, would that person notice anything in particular? Would it be obvious in any sense that something of religious significance was underway? Would you see Lent in people's faces, bodies, movements? Does it change the way they buy and sell, advertise, eat, and sleep? The answer to all of these questions is, alas, no. And that is the problem. What does indeed affect our bodies, what does mark the way we move and sleep and do business, what has profoundly written itself into our muscles and bones, is the modern ethos, the secular religion. And a beige, bland, attenuated Christianity is no match for such a powerful and focused adversary. To understand this phenomenon of the deculturalization of Christianity, we must consider, however briefly, the thought of the man generally regarded as the founder of modernity, René Descartes. In his groundbreaking and hugely influential Discourse on Method, Descartes lays out the program that has formed the culture that, in turn, has shaped most of us. Surveying the history of philosophical and religious thought, Descartes despairs of finding any coherency, consistency, or certitude. Whereas mathematics has remained impressively stable over the centuries, metaphysics and philosophy are a jumble of conflicting opinions, varying starting points, elemental disagreements. The greatest minds, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Thomas Aquinas, are at odds with each other, and, worse yet, there seems no common ground on the basis of which to adjudicate their disputes. Classical philosophy, in short, is like an old seaside city, full of winding streets, dead ends, collapsing buildings, and blind alleys, an ugly and dangerous place. Would it not be a desideratum, Descartes reasons, simply to tear down the old town, find a firmer construction site, and start afresh, this time under the guidance of one architect with a grand, unifying plan? The wrecking ball our philosopher chooses is the powerful one of systematic doubt. If a proposition or conviction can be doubted, it should be doubted. So avid is Descartes to discover philosophical terra firma that he swings this ball wildly, knocking over every idea, principle, experience, and assumption, save one. He finds that the one thing he cannot doubt is that he is doubting. The one thing the wrecking ball cannot knock over is itself. This intuition is expressed in what is certainly the most famous one-liner in the history of philosophy, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. In this luminously clear and distinct idea, utterly incapable of being doubted or thought away, Descartes had found his starting point, his foundation. Not in nature, not in the tradition, not in conversation, but in the private interiority of his consciousness, he has discovered the rock upon which he can confidently build his new modern city of thought. And the unified plan for the construction is a purely rational, mathematical method consisting of 4 steps. 1. Begin with clear and distinct ideas. 2. Break problems down into their component parts. 3. Move from one step to another in a chain of reasoning only when logic compels such a move. And 4. Rigorously check your work. Beginning with the cogito and following the methode, the Cartesian philosopher will design a safe, clean, orderly, and rationally satisfying system. The philosopher will build a modern philosophical city, happily unlike the untidy and confusing town of classical thought. Now this Cartesian approach, subjectivist, rationalist, suspicious, had an enormous influence not only on the shaping of the modern physical sciences, but also on the emergence of a typically modern understanding of religion. When Immanuel Kant at the end of the 18th century sought to articulate a religion within the limits of reason alone, he appealed to the luminous inner conviction of the moral imperative. All of religion, liturgy, ritual, biblical narrative, dogmas, creeds, can and should be reduced to this subjective sense that we must follow our ethical duty. And when Friedrich Schleiermacher, at the very beginning of the 19th century, endeavored to defend Christianity against its cultured despisers, he did so on the basis of the purportedly universal experience of being absolutely dependent. Again, everything else in the world of faith is reducible to that grounding mystical intuition. In short, both thinkers made a typically Cartesian appeal to a clear and distinct subjective starting point for the religious. Kant and Schleiermacher find an echo in 2 of the most influential 20th century theologians, Paul Tillich and Karl Rahner. For Tillich, Christianity is grounded in a sense of being ultimately concerned, that is to say, pressed upon by the unconditioned power of being itself, And for Rahner, faith rests on the individual's experience of standing in the presence of the absolute mystery, which conditions and lures all particular acts of knowing and willing. Interior, subjective experience is the religious terra firma, the rock upon which the whole structure is built. In the popular Christianity of the last 30 years, this
Sample complete. Ready to continue?